Good afternoon and welcome to today's Dorset Young Planners webinar on delivering green infrastructure through major residential development, the challenges and the enablers. Our speaker today is Nick Smith. He is Head of Geography and Planning at the University of the West of England. I am Frances Summers, a member of the Dorset Young Planners and a Senior Planning Policy Officer at Dorset Council. Just a few housekeeping points before we get into the presentation. The presentation will run for about 30 minutes, and after which we'll have time to do some question and answers. You are all muted to minimise any disruption. So if you do have any questions for either the speaker or if you're having any technical issues, if you pop them into your questions box, which should be on your GoToWebinar panel floating somewhere around your screen. What I'll do is I'll collate the questions and I'll ask them after the presentation. Any that we don't get time for will be considered after the session and the answers will be emailed out to all participants. A copy of the presentation will be included as a handout, so you can download that towards the end of the session. If you lose connection to the session, try rejoining via the original link. If our speaker loses connection, once I've finished panicking, if you just stay in the webinar and check your emails, because we may have to send out another link, but I'm sure that won't happen. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker, Nick Smith, as I said. The chances are, if you've worked or studied in the southwest of England, you'll know him because he used to work at Terence O'Rourke in Bournemouth, and he's now, as I said, Head of Planning and Geography at UWE. He clearly isn't busy enough because he's decided to embark on a PhD, and that's what today's session's about. He's just started this process, so this should be really interesting. The subject is obviously delivering green infrastructure on major residential development and the challenges and enablers of that. So I'll hand over to you, Nick, and please, listeners, please remember to send me some questions for Nick after his presentation. Thank you.
That's great, Francis. Thanks very much for that introduction, and thank you for everyone for being here this afternoon. Francis has already given me an introduction, which is very much appreciated. I think it's fair to say I love my job as head of school, and I love being part of the education of our future planners. And it's particularly sort of a pleasure working with the likes of Francis, who's part of the UWE alumni network, and it's great to sort of see her enthusiasm continues through the young planners today. So through my sort of teaching activity at UWE today, I'm very much focused around strategic planning, the delivery of major projects, and I think that sort of interest stems from my time at Terence O'Rourke in Bournemouth. And I know there's a few colleagues from there who are on this webinar this afternoon. But in that sort of time, I was involved, from a graduate plan to slightly more senior roles on sort of a mix of urban extensions and sort of new community projects. And seeing that sort of process initially sort of by observation and becoming more involved. And in terms of the PhD I'm embarking on now, which I would encourage anyone to think about, it's really good to sort of step back and look at these things, is to understand sort of some of the processes by which green infrastructure is moving forward. I suppose one of the things I would say is in my sort of time through education and also my time in practice, I've always been sort of committed, as I'm sure you are as well, about creating successful and sustainable projects, projects which we can be proud of. Obviously, that sort of involves a multiple of dimensions in terms of accessibility and design and sort of social cohesion and such like, but green space has always been something which is been of personal interest to myself. And clearly, as you will be aware from multiple sources, green space is highly beneficial. So the quote from the 25-year plan on the screen now talks about some of the benefits for both physical and mental health, but it also provides economic benefits and environmental benefits as well. And over sort of the last 10, 15, 20 years, the evidence base for explaining the benefits of green space has been progressively developed. And actually, one of the most recent contributions, which I think is very timely, particularly in these sort of times of COVID, is the Public Health England report on improving access to green space, which does a fantastic job of unpacking some of the evidence and the links to particularly on health, as you'd expect. What that report does is do a very useful job of providing some definitions. And as part of my PhD, this is something which no doubt will be attracting some word counts. Interestingly, my involvement with green infrastructure in an academic sense started back nearly 10 years ago now for a report which I worked with colleagues on at UWE for RICS. And that was basically a document to unpack what these terms actually meant, to understand the sort of process, identify the sort of the benefits, but also to look at some of the challenges and the sort of the thinking which would need to go into this. And although an information paper came out as response, there were some really interesting discussions which we had with different stakeholders, identifying, not only adding to the sort of the benefits for green infrastructure and green space, but also identifying some of the challenges which would arise from that. And that's certainly sort of stuck in my mind now. The quote on the left-hand side of the screen is very similar. There's a few tweaks to the definition which appears in the NPPF for English observers, and also is expanded on through planning practice guidance in relation to the natural environment. And so apart from this sort of policy grounding, there is also appreciation from consumers that green spaces is good. Now, certainly through COVID, a lot of articles were across the news about how people are valuing their parks and the need for investment, and in terms of very restricted exercise we're able to have, parks were brimming with activity. This table, this diagram comes from a excellent report produced by Place Alliance at the start of the year, which undertook an audit of projects. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But what's quite interesting about this diagram is it sort of asks consumers what they want to see in new development. And if you scan across all them little boxes, you can see that there is quite a strong connection with both kind of green infrastructure and green space as defined on the previous slide. So, although you've got things like parking and train stations appearing in that mix, there is also reference to quiet and peace and green space and design and trees, which clearly resonate with that agenda. So, it can be said, therefore, that consumers are becoming increasingly switched on. I think the people on the sales sites for new homes, I'm sure, were able to provide some additional insight to that. Now, back to the Place Alliance report. This was produced by, at the start of the year, in collaboration with not only Place Alliance, but CPRE, and led by a UCL team directed by Matthew Carmona, who's done some fantastic work around design quality and design codes over a significant amount of time. Now, through their study, what they did is audit 142 housing projects across England, of which 16 of those were in the southwest of England. And by analysing them individual schemes, each site was given a score, which is of interest. But also what they did do is look at individual criteria and see how individual schemes were doing in terms of ensuring sufficient quality. So, safety and security, you can see it's top of the list, highway design at the bottom of the list. And I suppose of interest for my particular study, existing new landscape was just above this sort of threshold line of 3. Character of development is in the red, public and open space less than that as well. And I do remember I was listening to the radio on the way to see one of my degree apprenticeships, and there's a Radio 5 phone-in, which is always an interesting affair. And on the day this report was published, and it was fascinating hearing a whole range of people and stakeholders phone in and talk about their experiences with new homes. I think interestingly, I'm sure some of them people may well have had experiences shown by some of these photographs appearing on the screen now. So the photographs on the right hand side are from the Place Alliance report, and I'm not sort of naming the scheme here. The schemes aren't named as such, but you can see from the sort of scattering of images where the problems may arise. Some of the calling to this phone-in was referring to house builders and the sort of the snagging and the problems they had encountered. Some of them, sort of temporary problems, which I'm sure have been fixed by now, but some of them were much more sort of inbuilt and difficult to sort of remedy from just sort of sticking a plaster over it. And the quality of the environment and quality of green space in the public realm was certainly an area which was being criticised, and certain house builders were being sort of named and shamed. But interestingly, the phone-in also had a range of house builders and landscape architects also contributing to that debate as well. Interestingly, for the Place Alliance report, going back to that, it does sort of split these sites between both greenfield and brownfield locations. And I think the sort of conclusion from this slide is that sort of 86% of greenfield schemes were defined as very poor, poor, or mediocre, or 28% as being defined as very poor or poor. Now, that obviously depends on, the assessment undertaken, and the report acknowledges that there are some elements which could be described as being subjective and may vary between the observer. But it did sort of push me to identify a problem within this area. And going back to the previous slide about the individual kind of factors, the report undertook sort of analysis around the provision of existing and new landscape. And you can see that in a sense the sort of bars on this chart are at the wrong end. Ideally they should be on the right hand side, but clearly, unfortunately, the frequency is higher on the left hand side. So in a way, the house builders were being challenged to kind of do better. And I suppose what I would say at this point is that my research isn't about bashing the house builders. And my time in consultancy, I was working with developers who were passionate about delivering some really high quality schemes. And a number of them have come forward and they look fantastic. So there is some really good practice out there. And Redrow, if you look at their website, have a commitment to contributing to green space, green infrastructure, about reconnecting consumers with nature. So the rhetoric is most definitely there. And also in relation to another house builder, Barratt Homes, as a precursor to our new National Design Code, and following on from the National Design Guide, they've created their own Great Places Guide, which basically sets some parameters for what should be happening across their own portfolio of sites, which I think is fantastic. Also, in my role at UWE, we were working with a knowledge exchange partnership with Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust in the scheme Build 'em in Nature. Some of our sort of viewers may have come across it. It's basically a scheme where projects can be appraised for their green infrastructure credentials. There's a series of principles spread out of core areas and other factors relating to well-being, water and wildlife. And depending on how the project fares, it then sort of gets a recognition at the end of the project. And speaking to those who are involved in this project, it's clear that the development industry is beginning to get kind of interested and excited about these type of opportunities. I suppose the other bit of sort of indication of positive change is also a piece of work which colleagues or sort of fellow academics, Alistair Scott and Matt Hislop, who does a lot of work on green infrastructure in Scotland, has been looking at the quality of policy. This project, Mainstreaming GI, does actually include a sort of tool where the quality and adequacy of policy scrutinised with a view to essentially improving that position. So on that basis, I'm kind of hoping that there may be some change in the footing. So we've included an interactive poll here, which Charlotte and Francis will help me run, just to get a flavour of what you think is likely to happen. So do you feel more confident or less confident that the planning, design and management of green infrastructure is set to improve over the next 10 years? So we've got a sort of scale from not confident at all to very confident. So Charlotte, there we go. There's the just on cue. There's the slide here. So vote now and see what you think. So hopefully a number of you are voting at this moment, and Charlotte will feed back in a moment in terms of what the scores are looking like.
Oh, they've appeared there now. Can you see them, Nick?
I can, yeah. So the sort of the most popular option is moderately confident, which is pleasing. But there's also a fairly sizable band which says not confident and not confident at all. So in that sense, my PhD does have some legs here, which is of use. So great. So we'll move on from that, and we've got another poll question in a moment to see what's going to happen. So my PhD, which started in Jan this year, so it's still in its infancy really, is essentially trying to answer that top question. So how does a planning and development process impact on the implementation of high quality GI in major residential developments? So basically, I'm getting my magnifying glass out to find out exactly what's going on, to identify the stages and inputs in terms of the planning, delivery and design of GI, to identify the actors and stakeholders involved, looking at the sort of experience of them, the attitudes they have, the skill sets maybe, and then to explore basically what sort of comes out the other end of the process. And it's not just purely looking at the operation of house builders. It's also looking at the role of planners, landscape architects, cost consultants, developers. As many people as we can track within this project. The project is located in the Oxford and Cambridge Arc. Some of you may well be located there at this moment. It is home to 3.7 million people, home to 2 million jobs. It is an area which is highly attractive and probably also fair to say suspicious of a new development coming forward. But there is some large-scale projects happening in the zone, which I'm sure you've been reading about for the planner and maybe for your own practices. The promise from government following a report by the National Infrastructure Commission in 2017 and a a sort of government-led prospectus, which had endorsement from the 32 local authorities which make up this area, is to build 1 million new homes by 2050, which clearly is quite a task, and unexpectedly has caused some reaction. Interestingly, the environmental impact of that development also raised headlines, and over the course of the summer, the sort of wildlife environmental sort of suite of interest groups has created a sort of nature's ark strategy, which essentially their sort of position, without sort of putting their words into my mouth, is that although they've raised concerns about the scale of the development, their view is, well, if it's going to happen, let's try and make the most of it and help this development repair and, indeed, in their words, rescue the environment taking place within this location. So it's ideally set up, I think, for my project. Now, in a sense, the project is split over stages 1 to 4. Stage 1 is the literature review, so you will remember your time when you did your dissertations yourself and ploughing through journal papers. That's what I'm currently doing at the moment. And then the next stage is to kind of understand essentially what's happening across the Oxford and Cambridge arc. So I've logged every local authority, looking at their local plan, looking at the sort of the major projects happening in those areas. And then what the plan is then is in stage 2 is to identify sort of 12 local authorities to undertake more detailed analysis. And then from them 12 local authorities, we will then identify a further, sort of narrow it down to 4. And then with each of them sort of 4, we'll look at 2 major projects in greater depth. So by sort of sequencing of analysis, the sort of level of analysis and insight will begin to extend. And the sort of final stage, which is the biggest part, is essentially sort of tracking 2 projects over the course of a 30-month period, and to essentially sort of see how that project sort of navigates and mediates through. So basically be a sort of fly on the wall, if I can, to see what's going on. My focus really is on sort of 3 connected areas. So it's very much around the sort of design, the planning, and the delivery. And these words, I'm sure, will mean certain things to yourselves in terms of kind of what it involves. But essentially, design is how the green infrastructure is responding to the context, site characteristics, the policy, how that vision is being developed. The planning is sort of, is very much around sort of the agreeing on the parameters, applying the mitigation, gaining the relevant consents, and then essentially sort of setting up for delivery through obligations and conditions. And then the sort of final part then is around the site construction, maintenance, and management. And of course, I should have said in the previous slide is that clearly over the course of this period, a lot will happen. And when I was reading the planning white paper of England, I was thinking and panicking how my research might need to sort of shift depending on what's going on. Now, the second poll we've got is quite a simplistic insight, I admit. We are sort of slightly constrained by how many sort of subcategories we can have in the question. But these are sort of 5 areas which the literature and sort of past discussions have identified is being potentially problematic. So the question here is, in your opinion, what is the greatest challenge with respect to the delivery of high quality green infrastructure? So we've got one option about the price by which land is acquired and promoted, another one around viability, another one about sort of developer investment intentions, another around enforcement, another one about maintenance and longer term management. So the point you had in your mind may not be on our list, but do excuse that. But just on these topics, it'd be just interesting to see where you would position yourself. So I'm already excited to see what's come out the quiz, or the poll, I should say. Yeah, so interesting. There's quite a nice spread across these categories. So viability is identified as the most significant sort of challenge, followed by developer investment or investor intentions, maintenance, followed by process, and then lastly enforcement. So that's interesting. Thank you very much for your inputs there. So clearly, one of the things I do at UWE to our first year students is to explain how the planning system works and how development works. And clearly, for that, we present it in a quite simplistic term. But what my research is keen to do, and based, use previous research on this, is to kind of explore every one of these boxes and the links between these boxes to find out what's going on. And I was reading last week a really great report by Knight Frank called Building and Beauty, which was sort of using a fictitious scheme in Farnborough and looking at the planning system from the perspective of a landowner, and looking at the sort of the tax concerns and the sort of the governance arrangements for how these projects come forward. So that's one example of complexity. Another one is, we've often sort of picked up that the strategy around design and mitigation requires that formality via conditions and via legal agreement. Who's involved in that drafting is something kind of perhaps lost in translation or negotiation or arguments, I don't know, and ultimately how's that project set up. So that's another example of an area I'm going to be looking at. Now, just to sort of provide an example of the sort of places which I potentially will be looking at, the case studies will ultimately be anonymous, so to help people come forward. But two projects which I think are good examples of the sort of type of issues I'm picking up are as follows. So the first one is the Oxfordshire Cotswolds Garden Village, and this has sort of come forward on sort of with collaboration between Grosvenor, West Oxfordshire Council and Oxfordshire County Council. There may be people on this webinar who are actually involved in that, so hopefully I'm saying this correctly, but do excuse me if the details is slightly off. But for this scheme, you could argue this has a degree of simplicity about it. I'm sure those involved are now shaking their head to say this isn't a simple example. But what you can say about this, it does have a fairly recent local plan. It has a local plan allocation for a garden village. There is a policy which is pretty comprehensive about the type of green infrastructure required. The policies about the allocation talk about what is required, and basically the sort of vision has sort of jumped from the policy pages from a local plan into the sort of community consultation, which, as you can see on the screen here, was led by Kevin Murray on behalf of Grosvenor. And you can see here, number 2, value in nature, clearly sort of replicates the sort of the messages and narrative, as I mentioned, from the 25-year plan and other sources. So sort of going through that sort of planning process, if you look at the application, and as a planning geek, I've been doing this a lot, looking through all the various elements of the outline application. You can see here that green infrastructure features in multiple documents. And thankfully with OneDrive, I've been able to download the whole lot without too much issue. And you can see that every one of these documents treats green infrastructure in slightly different ways. So you've got the parameter plans produced by Terence O'Rourke here on behalf of Grosvenor, which identify the sort of broad parcels where green infrastructure is going to be provided. You can see the corridors here. You can see some of the interventions taking place, and the support and strategy and statements explain, that in greater detail. The draft header terms identifies how that will be delivered. And then the illustrative master plan sort of brings that to life for the sake of the community to see what's going on. Looking at this application is live at the moment. I looked at the comments just before I came on air. They're still trickling in. Some are supportive, some are not. But it's interesting that the green space doesn't seem to be kind of one element which there seems to be support for. The other scheme, which is kind of used to kind of show the sort of complexity of these major projects, is Graven Hill in Bicester. And this was a former MOD site which has been released for reuse. And the planning consent for this dates back to 2011, and the application was approved in 2014. And it's now been built out on site. I went here a few weeks ago. I dragged my children here to look around the site to try and generate some future plans of the future, and we explored this site to see what was going on. And interestingly, not to say that this policy context is inadequate in any way, not at all, but you can see, because it's had a sort of longer process of generation, it's had to sort of navigate a dynamic planning environment. So not only in relation to sort of change in national policy, certainly in terms of when the scheme was being designed, but also locally as well. But I think what it is that you can see the enablers of delivering successful green infrastructure being in place. So condition 26 requires a submission of a master plan, design code, and within the sort of the description, it sort of therefore explains the level expectation around this. And as I said, I've been looking through these documents and been impressed by what's been generated. So the developer here has commissioned design code. There's a couple of versions of this now, but some of the sort of the principles which were arising from the sort of initial consultation and some of the stakeholder collaboration, some of them principles have now come forward in the design code. And one concept was this idea of swale parks, which should have linked the scheme together. This idea of delivering networks, which is critical to green infrastructure, has gone from an artist's impression to looking at case studies elsewhere, how this has been mobilized in other projects. Some very basic principles here, which are then being worked up into some more detailed schematic plans as well. And when I got to site, I was very pleased by the fact that these things are now in place. It's not complete, but certainly the fabric is there and being worked up at the moment. And admittedly, this photograph was taken quite early in the morning before most people were up, I think. But the places look successful. They look well used, and I'm sure very successful. But I think when you look at the complexity of this site, it sort of identifies the sort of the change in planning dimensions, the complexity of the development process. And what I've been doing is sort of tracking the planning history. So I've looked at the online application searches, logged them, and then started to sort of color code them in terms of what's been going on. So that's a snapshot. This is a more illustrative example I'm going to show in a moment. But one thing which is interesting in the scheme is the range of house types it provides. So not only does it include the conventional developer, house builder-led properties, it also includes affordable housing properties, but also a large community of self-build homes as well. So on that basis, because that may be, the history is quite complex. So going back to that spreadsheet, you can see I've color-coded various things from, scope and opinion requests to variation of conditions, discharge of conditions, non-material amendments, submission of reserve matters. And when you track that, across sort of in recent times, there is sort of multiple entries, and each one of these lines has different consultants on board, different agents, different clients, all admittedly following the sort of the same principles, but it does create a complex project, which over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, we're interested to see what happens. So I guess in a sense, M2 projects, certainly the Oxfordshire project, hasn't got consent at the moment. That's just about to be launched. This one is sort of in process. So my kind of question really is in terms of, will these schemes pick up the same issues as reported by Place Alliance and the work of Matthew Carmona, or on the basis of this developer interest, reformed planning policy, and events such as like this, will there be an upturn in the delivered quality? And just in terms of the Graven Hill community, a lot of talk has been about the actual properties on board, and it's certainly interesting going from plot to plot to see what has happened and the different sort of client-led schemes about what consumers want. Interestingly, from a green space provision, it's clear that some clients are not so keen on green space, others are very keen. But I suppose my concern is very much about how the green space which links these individual plots together will function. Now, this is just one example scheme. I'm not necessarily going to use that as an example through my research, but hopefully it does give an indication of the pressures and challenges which are there to be explored. So ultimately, this project is all about implementation. I'm sure you remember this from your university days of looking at sort of the steps to perfect implementation, and I'm sure for your day-to-day jobs, you'll reflect on this as well. And through my project, I'll be exploring each one of these boxes to essentially see how this relates to green infrastructure delivery. So this is a selection of factors from Caney. They're not linked to green infrastructure per se, it's about any form of policy, but they could have relevance. So in terms of our GI policies clear? Does everyone understand them, from the landowner, the developer, to the end contractor, to the residents who live there? Is there the resources required? So the point about viability, may link into this, and the complexity. I think I've helped to showcase, and the research will be unpicking, I think, is critical. I've got a diagram which I've sort of tried to map every sort of decision stage and who's involved, and the sort of type of mindsets or the type of objectives they have, and how that shapes. And then the last one, in terms of the conditions which are kind of external to the policymakers and those directly involved, clearly will have an issue. And my concern, in the sense, is we are clearly in very uncertain times at times. We've got the pressure to engage with green space, but we also have some very strong financial challenges ahead of us as well. So how that plays out in the sort of wider world is something that I'm keen to explore. And I'm certainly very keen to hear from you if you're keen to provide your insights into this. And so if you're keen to do this, then drop me an email on this is my student email address, so students may spot another email address and my phone number, but I'd be really pleased to hear from anyone who is interested as well. But thanks again, Francis, for letting me to have a pitch here, and I'm very happy to take any questions on it.
Oh, lovely. Thank you, Nick. That was fascinating, and quite frankly, I'm a little bit jealous that I'm not doing this PhD. it's going to be very interesting if, like, the premises that are set out in the housing white paper, for instance, on, with the emphasis on design, but also on, binding housing numbers, if that comes to fruition, it'll be interesting to see if that places more emphasis on green infrastructure and its delivery, or less. So it'll be really good if that comes to fruition, if it ever does, during the progress of your PhD. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing the outcomes. But so we've had a few questions. Let me just pull them up, and I'm still getting them through now. So they're twofold. Some of them are academic, some of them are about practice. So I'll start with the academic ones. So how did you, or how will you select your project sites, and how have you done that so far? Are you muted? Are you
I
talking?
am,
I
yeah,
don't know.
sorry. Yeah, at the moment, I've just basically been casting my eye across what's been happening across the Oxford and Cambridge area, and I've been sort of well, surprised, impressed by the huge level of activity taking place. And what I'm looking to do is to sort of to initially to kind of undertake an appraisal of the local plans, and to kind of identify those with a comparable level of policy support, and then on that basis pick out those projects of plus 500 homes in those areas, and then to begin to explore that. There'll be in terms of the more in-depth analysis which I'm proposing at the end of the project.
Mm,
There will be a need, in a sense, to try and work with teams who are quite open for me to be involved, rather than me sort of trying to covertly see what's going on.
yeah.
But at the moment, yeah, but I'm keen to sort of get examples of different types of projects by
Mm,
size, by sort of by their formation, and also some geographical spread in that too.
yeah. Lovely. So I suppose, why did you choose the Oxford Cambridge Art? Just because you happened to notice that there was quite a lot of good schemes there.
I think in the terms, one of the things which I was looking at in terms of case study selection was, well, how do we do this? And there was and I've been looking at the comments as you've been speaking, Francis. I know Grant was referring to some research in Lincolnshire, which sounds
Mm,
fascinating. One approach could have been to sort of scattergun projects across the whole of the sort of England or the UK beyond. Um, I suppose I was a bit sort of anxious of ensuring that there's a degree of similar baseline to these locations. But I
mhm,
think what sort of drew me was this sort of interplay between the sort of
mhm,
nature's arc strategy, and also the sort of development arc as well.
mm,
So there's sort of a natural navigation of
mhm,
stakeholders as part of this project. So
mhm.
um, yeah, it's a position I've taken.
Yeah.
I might live to regret it. I don't know, but it potentially makes my life slightly more easier to begin with.
Yeah, I suppose, obviously I've just finished my masters, and what this first thing that strikes me is that you start off with quite a wide area, and then you sort of whittling that down to four, aren't you? You do, oh, sorry, was it four? Um, so can you generalize from that, do you think, or are you going to find out more throughout the process, or is it just that it's just this area?
Well, yeah, so it's a really good question, Francie. And the one thing I'm going to do sort of early on obviously the literature review will sort of provide a sort of picture of the general position,
Mm,
and events such as this help to sort of tease out particular issues. And some fantastic comments in the chat, by the way, but thanks very much for that. Um, in terms of sort of focusing on that initial sort of swathe of 12 authorities, I'm proposing a sort of online survey to sort of to tease out some more of these issues, and
mm,
that them sort of conversations may also help me to sort of guide towards the locations I choose. Clearly,
mm,
there will be caveats in terms of what I'm able to sort of show, and I suppose, going back to the Place Alliance report, which kind of looked at quite a large volume of schemes, what I'm
mm,
going for is sort of something which is more concentrated, but hopefully, by looking at longer term, I can add another dimension, not necessarily a better dimension, but another dimension to that argument.
Excellent. Really interesting. Right. Okay. So let's go to some of the sort of more practice questions now then. Ooh. So one of the questions was, how can landscape architects push for more green infrastructure in housing schemes, as landscape is often value engineered?
Well, yeah, and I think that
Uh,
that was yeah, and I think
Sorry, I was
that
just going
was
to say,
interesting on
as
this.
you know at the minute.
Yeah, on this sort of phone-in, I remember on Radio 5, there was a number of landscape architects who were doing an excellent job of actually defending their role within it and talking about, they've had their ideas diluted.
Mm,
Partly by cost consultants who mentioned in part, but also by their clients, but also in terms of issues around adoption, even in relation to the perceptions of residents, whether they want this on their site or not. So I
mm,
think I'm not sort of well, I am kind of dodging the question in some, but I think it's the complexity which is something which I need to kind of get my head around. But I don't think it's a
mm,
case of presenting one group as being sort of blame free. I think there'll be
mm,
lessons for everyone. And I spotted the I think in Grant's comment about the
mm,
point around education, and I think that's a really
yeah.
a really good point. At UWE Bristol, we do a lot on green infrastructure. The third year planners actually did a project in South Gloss about regreening a town. Um,
Mm,
but the question there was they acquired I think a huge amount of learning, but the sort of delivery issues were still perhaps unseen because obviously that's a sort of dimension which will happen over a period of time.
yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, because like not only educating the planners, as I say, I'm a policy officer. It's sort of educating politicians as well, and having it from very much from an objective right the way through the plan. I mean, I had a look at sort of places in Copenhagen, I think it is, and Germany, who really they they design development around green infrastructure rather than green infrastructure being bolted on. So, and it seems to be sort of a very top-down agenda throughout their sort of from a national sort of level. So, yeah, that's a really good point, the education part. Um, Probably got time for another couple of questions. So, would it not be helpful to structure the subject as, firstly, the local planning authority defines the green zones that need to be protected from development, also um, lands needing green improvement. Secondly, the LPA controls the quality of what changes are proposed in development schemes and then undertakes improvements and encourages social action to improve the whatever needs improved. You got any comment on that?
Well, and I think this is sort of, I think that's a sort of very sort of logical sort of stepping stones, and I think in
Mm,
terms of that literature review, and although that sort of diagram sort of started from
mm,
the sort of the site acquisition, it could start from the other way, from looking at the allocation of land, the
mm,
development of a green infrastructure strategy. And one of the things which I think is really interesting, for the plan and white paper is it's sort of talking about essentially removing the need for outline
yeah.
permissions and essentially going for a sort of detailed local plan allocation supported by design codes and such like. Um,
Mm,
the schemes I've been looking at so far have design codes, but they also have the benefit of Section 106 agreements and
mm,
outline consents as well, and a lot of
yeah.
consultation. So uh,
Mm.
these different models, I think, will certainly require some further interrogation.
Brilliant. I think this will be the last one, and then whatever ones we haven't gotten around to uh, replying to, we can send via an email. But this one is, I think it is a good idea to have a GI scoring system for major planning applications. Refuse the application if it doesn't score above an agreed standard. What do you think? Could this be a requirement included in local plan green infrastructure policy? And have you come across thus far, come across any workable examples?
Well, the Building with Nature sort of program, which I mentioned earlier on the presentation, is essentially sort of could potentially get there. At the moment, It is very much led by the developer, sort of with encouragement, sort of takes initiative, progresses their scheme through, presents information. It is sort of independently assessed and audited, and at the end of the day, they come up with a sort of score in terms of how well they've done. And clearly, those on the sort of lower score are pushed to go further. There is a dialogue initially. I'm not sure where that's got to of trying to sort of formalise that in a policy context, in terms of actually requiring a scheme to have a certain level or not. I do remember going to some of the sort of initial workshops about the sort of pros and cons of that in terms of how big should the carrot be, how big should the stick be. One of the things though, which I think is important though, is in that discussion was sort of where that assessment takes place. And one of the concerns, and is that when you look at the sort of consultation boards, where you look at the outline application, or even sort of the first stage of reserve matters, it all looks fantastic. But to what extent does that maintain that standard moving forward, or what's the situation, plus 5 years of completion, 10 years of completion? And when I'm out and about, there are schemes out there which I think look as good as they were when they were completed. Other schemes where they've been neglected, and there's probably a range of reasons for that. To what extent can that be sort of picked up and managed through the planning process is, I think, subject to debate.
Definitely. Right, well, thank you very much, Nick. And I just want to wish you good luck with it all, and hope that you remember us when you've got your doctorate.
Thanks for the positive thinking, Francis. Yeah, but one day, hopefully.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, just a quick reminder for the listeners, we'll send out answers to any questions that we haven't managed to get around to via an email. The PowerPoint is available to download. It's on the GoToWebinar panel now. And a recording of this presentation will be on YouTube probably about early next week. On YouTube, you can also see the Dorset Young Planners other webinar on how to build a town square. And what we're hoping to do is follow that scheme through to completion. So keep an eye out there for more webinars on that. And I hope listeners will be with me on hoping that I can persuade Nick to come back and tell us more about how he's getting on further into the process of his PhD. Hint, hint, Nick.
Yeah, happy to, yeah.
Thank you. Also, have a look on the RTPI events page for other virtual opportunities. There's a good one, it looks good tomorrow, on reinforcing good design principles on small to medium scale developments. A survey will launch immediately as soon as you close this down, and would really appreciate it if you could take the time to give us some feedback. So yes, thank you again, Nick, and good luck with your PhD. And bye for now, everybody.
Okay, thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
Good
bye.
day.